Good afternoon, welcome everyone. This is actually a joint sponsored event, and I'm Nancy Chen. I'm actually the new director of the Blum Center here at UCSC, and actually this is co-sponsored with the Everett program, and I'd like to introduce a new colleague, Professor Chris Bennett, who will be coming to join us in the spring as he did first. He's the Dorothy E. Everett main chair of the new Everett Fellows Program, formerly known as the GEEP, Global International Global Information Internship Program here at UCSC. So we're very, very proud to welcome a dear colleague of ours who was the founding director of CJTC, the Center for Justice, Tolerance, and Community here at UCSC. Pretty much about, 15 years ago when I first came here at UC Santa Cruz. He's since moved on to be a number of things at University of Southern California. He's the professor of sociology as well as American Studies and Ethnicity. In addition, he is the director of the program of PERI, which is the USC program for environmental and regional equity. He's also the co-director of the Center for the Study of Immigration Integration. And so his title today is on demographic change, economic inequality, and the future of California. And so please join in a warm welcome for Professor Manuel Pastor.
Thank you for that kind introduction. I'll explain why I'm using the mic in a minute, but a couple things. One is, first, just glad to be here. Good to see old friends and hopefully some new friends as well. I did notice it was very difficult for you to say University of Southern California. So it just made me painful. And also, I do want to say that I'm an economist by training, which means that's the reason why economic is misspelled in the first chart. We don't always get everything right. In fact, the economists usually get nothing right. So we'll see how that goes. So I'm going to talk today a little bit about economic change, demographic change, what's going on demographically in the state of California, a little bit about the state of inequality in California, but mostly about how much as there's a sort of new California in terms of the demography, there's a sort of new story with regard to the relationship between inequality and economic growth that is beginning to change people's perspective, so that things that were once thought of as simply anti-poverty strategies to deal with issues of fairness, inclusion, or justice are actually really key to recuperating the state economy and actually recuperating the national economy as well. And then I want to close a little bit by talking about how we're going to get there, which, perhaps no surprise to any of you, is probably not really through research, although we can help. But it'll be mostly through the vibrant social movements that have been taking root in California in the last 10, 15, 20 years, and in particular the way in which they're scaling to the state level. So I'm going to try to do all of that quickly. I always like to, so the reason I'm using the mic, and I always like to explain to people before I get started, is that I actually, while I'm speaking, my voice might break a little bit, because I actually have a speech disorder that developed since I moved to Los Angeles. It must be the smog. And actually it's something that's called spasmodic dysphonia. It spasms around your voice box. Some famous people have it. Diane Rehm from NPR, Robert Kennedy Jr., and now me. And I always like to also reassure people that it gets treated once a month to get the muscles to relax with Botox, which is how we treat everything in Los Angeles. So it seems to work really well for us. So for some of you, the happiest day of the year is your birthday or Christmas or Hanukkah or the end of Ramadan. For someone like me, the happiest day of the year is the day the census releases its statistics. And in 2010, what we found out for the United States as a whole, and those are the green charts, is that the growth rate for Latinos in the United States was 43% in that decade period. The growth rate for Asian Pacific Islanders was 43%. The growth rate for African Americans, about 11%. The growth rate for non-Hispanic whites, 1%. So that's pretty dramatic difference. And it's one of the reasons why when in 2012, Barack Obama won with only 39% of the white vote. In fact, Mitt Romney had a landslide there amongst the whites. Why it was when the commentators on the news kept going, oh my God, the country's changed, the country's changed. People like me were going, where were you the last couple of years when the statistics from the census were already out? The interesting thing about this change nationally, and it's in particular true here in California, is that when people see the significant growth in particular of Latinos and Asians, they tend to think that what's driving that is immigration. And the answer to that is that it's no longer what's driving demographic growth in the United States. In fact, immigration in the United States for about the last 3 years has stabilized. And it's not just a function of a slower economy in the United States or increased border enforcement, although those play a role, but it's really a function of two more fundamental things. Both Latin American and Asian economies are more buoyant than they ever were in the past. They actually weathered the global financial crisis better than we did in the United States. And even more importantly, a change in the fertility rates in Mexico. 35, 40 years ago, over the course of her lifetime, a Mexican woman would have 5 children. Currently, the fertility rate in Mexico is 2.3. That's a dramatic change, mostly through family planning. And the fertility rate in the United States is 1.7. So as those two fertility rates come together, the push factors are no longer there. And despite the popular imagination, for the last 3 years, net migration from Mexico has been 0. There's as many people returning to Mexico as are coming into the United States, which, by the way, is probably one of the reasons behind the crisis of the unaccompanied minor children at the border, which is coyotes, traffickers, trying to drum up new traffic because they're no longer getting as many Mexicans crossing the border. So, what is going on in California? What's interesting I want you to note in California, as we move from the U.S. to California, is that those growth rates are actually lower in California for Latinos and Asian Americans. The growth rate for whites is -5%. Essentially what's going on, and you'll see this in a little bit more, is that while there's a demographic change process that's occurring in the country as a whole, it's actually now mostly occurring outside of California, and the demographic change that foreshadowed what would go on in the nation has occurred in California. So what's driving it? Again, it's no longer immigration. What's driving the change nationally is the change in the number of children. So this shows you that in that decade period for the rates I was showing you, that the number of young whites under the age of 18 in California and the United States actually fell by 4.3 million. Now, that does not mean that 4.3 million young white people died. We would have noticed that. It would have been reported with great alarm on Fox News and preemptively blamed on Obamacare. I mean, you know that would happen. So what it means is more people are moving into 19 and 20 than are moving into 1 and 2, and so the number of young whites falls. Number of young African Americans fell nationally by about 250,000. Some of that's redesignation into the other category, but not as much as people think. One thing we've noticed is that young African Americans are tending to mark black pretty consistently, not as much of a shift over to the multiracial category. The growth rate, Latinos at 4.8 million, Asian Pacific Islanders at 800,000. That's the next America. That's the next America. What does that mean in California? Again, interestingly, in California, the growth rate for young Californians who are white, -21%. Growth rate for young African Americans, -20%. But very modest growth rates for the Latinos and Asians who are young as well, which is kind of interesting. In fact, here's a great statistic you can use at cocktail parties because nothing spices up cocktail parties like demography. The only large metro area in the United States in the last 10 years, and by large metro area I mean places like Baltimore, Miami, Denver, Atlanta, of the top 100 metro areas, the only large metro area that did not see an increase in the number of Hispanic children in the last decade? Los Angeles. Because Los Angeles is coming to the end of a process. Its Latino population is more settled. They may be immigrant, but in fact our share of immigrants in Los Angeles has been falling for the last 3 to 4 years. It's a more U.S.-born population. It's a longer settled immigrant population, so more delay in childbirth, reduced family sizes, etc. And the other thing about Los Angeles is basically any white person who was going to leave already did. So that demographic isn't changing as much as well. So what does that look like for the nation and for California? If you look at the United States, in 1980, the U.S. was about 80% non-Hispanic white. It's projected by the year 2042 or so to become majority minority, that is majority people of color. Now that's an interesting statistic, but to me the one that's even more interesting is that 10 years before that, the majority of the workforce, now listen carefully, not the majority of entrants into the workforce, the majority of the workforce will be people of color by around 2031 or so. But within before the next census, the majority of youth will be people of color. So the change is going on in the United States as a whole. But you can see here, if you look at the change that's going on in the U.S. between 2000 and 2040, that in the year 2000, the U.S. was 69% white, that in the year 2040, it'll be about 50% non-Hispanic white. That is basically the change that California went through between 1980 and 2000. So in some ways, California is America fast forward. The demographic change in California is the demographic change the U.S. is about to experience rolling forward. And if you think about those 20 years, they were pretty bumpy years for race relations in California. 1992, LA civil unrest. 1994, Prop 187 campaign, the proposition that was widely perceived as being anti-immigrant generally, and was trying to take away services from undocumented residents, including educational services, fights around affirmative action, etc. And it's perhaps no surprise that those fights now are occurring in other states in the United States, even as those fights have in some sense settled here in California. Think about who the Speaker Pro Tem is, Kevin De Leon. Kevin De Leon was baptized politically by organizing the March Against 187 in Los Angeles, in which Mexican flags were flown, and it was kind of considered a very radical protest. That's how he learned his politics, was through this immigrant struggle. Now, in the current period, which is only 30 years later, 20 years later, we've got a situation in which the guy's head of the state senate, and on his agenda is putting in place something that will take away the last vestiges of 187. What's also on the agenda is something that will put back some of what was taken away by Prop 227, the fight around bottling the lead. So huge bumps that happened in California, and then there's an interesting sort of coming to the end of it, which we're experiencing in California. And you can see demographically why that is as well. It's kind of interesting, when people saw this change between 1980 and then 2000 and then 2010, and you can see that the bulk of the growth is coming from Latinos, right? What they imagined, what they were projecting was literally that the California would become majority Latino by the year 2035. That was the projection just 5 years ago, which would have meant that everybody would have to say California the right way. No more Santa Cruz, it'd have to be Santa Cruz, right? Watsonville would always be Watsonville, but there you go. So, actually it's Watsonville. But what you can see now for California as a whole is that demographic change is projected to kind of slow down, right? You can see that it's kind of coasting into a sort of equilibrium. There will be more or less a long-term equilibrium. The state now projects out to 2065, and even by 2065, they're no longer projecting a majority Latino state. And some of that, again, has to do with the shift in the nature of the Latino population. What's going on? The percent foreign born in the United States, while it remains kind of creeping up, it's actually stabilizing. That's the green line in California as a whole. One place that's still going up is in the Silicon Valley, right next to you. But the share of foreign born has been on the decline in Los Angeles and San Francisco for the last 3 to 4 years. So it's a much more homegrown population, and it's a very settled immigrant population. This takes the states of the United States and raised them by the share of immigrants who are relatively recent, they came since 1999, and the percent of them who have been in the country since then. So 72% of California's immigrants have been here for about 11 or 12 years. In fact, half of our undocumented have been here for about 10 or 11 years. Very deeply rooted and settled population. I always like to point out that the state that has the second most settled immigrant population is Vermont, but that's because they have like 2 immigrants, and they've both been there a very long time. So, but no, so it's a very, so the thing to remember about demography, and I think it helps us to think this in terms of the economy too, is the future ain't what it used to be. That is, people tend to have in their mental mind a picture of the future based on the past, rather than a picture of the future based on some projections that will tell you what's actually it's going to look like. So people think of us as this heavily immigrant state, yes, but we're stabilizing. And we have, as mentioned, a lot of immigrants. We also have a lot of undocumented immigrants. And this is the statistic I think is the most striking. Roughly 1 in 6 kids in California have at least one undocumented parent. And of those, over 80% are U.S. citizens. So the other thing people think of when they think of the undocumented population is a population that has loose attachments, right? Just arrived, working in a day labor site. And in fact, it's a much more settled immigrant population. I still remember this story, which I'll just take a moment to tell, which is when I left Santa Cruz in 2007. One of the last things I did was go to a community meeting in Live Oak, and it was the community meeting of the IAF organization that's here, which the name is now escaping me. We consulted for them. But anyway, they organized a thing in the unincorporated territory of Live Oak to get the county supervisors to put in a community center, to get the county board of ed to agree to expand ESL classes, and to get Cabrillo College to agree to create a pipeline to the middle school that was there so that kids would stay on the right track. And it's a great meeting, and everybody from the board, the supervisors and adult ed program at Cabrillo College agreed to all of these demands. There were about 200 people there. One of the people who spoke was a guy who I knew, Mexican immigrant, who was actually the head of my kids' PTA at Brant's Ford Elementary, which, by the way, anybody who has kids knows having a man be the head of the PTA is like a miracle, right? So this guy was a really dedicated parent. He owned a roofing business in town. His daughter was one of the star students at Harbor High. And I felt when I walked out of that hallway that evening, like, man, this is democracy. This is America. People stand up and they ask for something and they get the authorities to actually do that. And that night, that man was picked up by Immigration and Customs Enforcement and deported. Because he was an undocumented Californian. He'd been living here for a very long time. He was actually applied to regularize his status. And in the process of doing that, wound up getting snared by ICE for bad paperwork. But the image you should have in mind is not the person you think of, but that guy. Because there's a lot more of those guys and his family. Both he and his wife actually got deported and stranded their 4 kids in Santa Cruz, and the community organization essentially took over the family, got her through high school, etc. What's the name of the group here in Monterey, the IAF group? Anyway, I'm sure I'll remember by the end of the talk. So anyway, same thing in the Silicon Valley. People don't expect there's a lot of undocumented in Silicon Valley. There are, because every place there's high-tech workers, there's an army of nannies and food workers, etc. So a lot of undocumented there as well. And what's happening in California is this demographic change is coming kind of all over the state. This is the state in 1980, darker shades, higher percent people of color. In 1980, only one county in California was majority minority. That's Imperial County, right by the border. Los Angeles hadn't quite crossed that threshold yet. In 2010, this is what the state looks like. In 2040, this is what the state looks like. So 2 things about that. If you have friends in some of those light areas that don't have a good taqueria near them now, tell them, don't worry, one is coming. And the second thing, what is up with Sierra? So the interesting thing, so that's an interesting map about where the demographic change is going to occur. But the other thing that's interesting about this is that if you look at where the youth growth is going to occur as well, it's through the Inland Empire and the Central Valley. And interestingly, in terms of thinking about how you move policy, it's important to realize that if you're thinking about sort of organizing people who try to do social change, social justice work, you've got pretty established infrastructures in the Bay Area and in Los Angeles. You've got transitions that are undergoing in Orange County and San Diego, which is a place you don't normally think of, but you've got to recognize that San Diego, at least for just a few minutes, elected a progressive mayor who turned out to be a sexual harasser and wound up getting appropriately booted out of office. But that was a big seismic shock for San Diego, which was that the south of 8, mostly people of color vote, south of Freeway 8, were able to actually swing the city election. And in fact, San Diego has just passed a minimum wage of $11.50 an hour. It's not very high, but they passed a minimum wage before Los Angeles, which is, I use a lot in LA to try to embarrass us into action, like, fucking San Diego, So there's a lot of change going on in those areas, and then you've got really weak organizing infrastructures in the Inland Empire and in the Central Valley. You've got a lot of potential, but you've got a lot of weak infrastructures. And in fact, the future of California is going to be sort of created, not here. I mean, getting one more Democrat in Santa Cruz is not going to be like a big haul. It's not going to really change the state, right? But if you can change the balance of power in Orange County and San Diego and through the Imperial County and into this Imperial Inland Empire and into this Central Valley, you actually change the state dramatically. And so these are what we and some of our political analysis that Chris and I and others do with sort of community organizers across the state call the fish hook regions, because if you bait that hook, you can actually change the whole state. And it requires thinking about how you take the infrastructure from coastal California and make sure it gets into inland California. The traditional divide people have thought of in the state is between the north and the south. I mean, I know about this because I grew up in LA, then I moved here where it was supposed to be an embarrassment to be from Los Angeles, right? And then I married a Northern Californian she was born in the Mission and grew up in Napa, and she viewed it as a major act of charity for marrying me, right? So, because I'm from Southern California, now I'm back in Southern California, we just don't care about you any longer, right? So, but the traditional divide has been north and south, but if you think about the politics of LA and the Bay Area, they're very similar. What is different is inland California, and that's where the changes are going to occur in the state. And what's interesting is that if you look at that, there's a huge gap here in terms of the voter turnout from eligible voters, that where it's heavy is in the Bay Area. It's also heavy here in the Sierras. Where it's really light is in the central part of the state. So these are important areas of the state. One last thing, I'm going to just say I'll say one thing about this, but I won't show you the maps because it takes too long. The other big demographic change that's going on, you can kind of see it by looking, for example, at the Latino population in the Bay Area. In 1980, the Mission, little bits of Oakland, East San Jose. 2010, Redwood City, South San Francisco, this is Redwood City, San Mateo, Redwood City, Palo Alto, Fremont, Hayward, East Oakland, Richmond, San Rafael. And that demographic change is significant, not just because it's Latinos, but there's something going on in the United States right now that's really fundamental, which is that the demographic change is occurring most rapidly in America's suburbs. And that's also where poverty is growing the most rapidly as well. So some of you, when you thought of Ferguson, may have associated with police brutality. What somebody like me sees with Ferguson is that it was 70% white 30 years ago. It's 70% African American right now. Whites are holding on to the political structure, and they've created a police force that preys on its own people. Which, by the way, is a lot like Maywood in Southern California. It's a lot like a lot of suburbs, right? So there's a lot of work that needs to be done in suburbs as well. Last thing on the demography, which I think is really the most interesting thing about demography, has to do with the age structure of our populations. When you look for the United States as a whole, the median age, half older, half younger, for non-Hispanic whites is 42. In California, it's 45. For Asians, 35. For African Americans, 32. Native Americans and Pacific Islanders, around 30. For Latinos, the median age nationally and in the States, 27. So 42, 27, it's a generation gap. And it helps to explain our demographic change, because when you're 27, you're in prime family formation age. When you're 42, you think you're in prime family formation age, right? You may be. But it also explains our politics. The state, for example, in the United States that has the biggest generation gap, whitest old, brownest young, is Arizona. With its fractious politics around immigration, ethnic studies in the schools, etc. But more than that, Arizona had, in the last 5 years, the third largest cuts in K through 12 spending per capita, per student. It had the largest cuts in public university spending and the largest increases in tuition for public universities. And lest you think that that's just a one-off, this is a map of local revenue, the revenue spent by local authorities, counties, etc., on education per child. And then this is a map of the generation gap. And one thing you're going to note is a kind of photo negative, right? And again, if you think that that's a visual trick, it holds in a time series cross-section fixed effects regression in which we control for the other variables that should be explaining local spending per child, which means if you're one of our more quantitative friends, you might have understood what I said, and if you're not, all it means is I'm right. So that we're going to be releasing a paper about the generation gap and its impacts on spending. Now, all of this is occurring as the United States has been hitting peak level of inequality. The blue line is the share of income going to the top 1%, and you can note that the peaks here in 1928, the year before the Great Depression, and 2007, the year before the Great Recession, and that inequality continues to rise. The interesting thing about this is it's also very true of California. California used to be one of the more equitable states in the United States. Now it's about the 7th most unequal state in the United States. More unequal, has a higher Gini coefficient than Alabama and Georgia, places we've always been proud to emulate. So we've got this problem of inequality in the state. And when people see the issues of inequality, there are sort of three don't worry about it that come up. One is, well, we're unequal, but there's a lot of mobility, right? That, might be that there's a lot of positions in the economy, but people move pretty rapidly over time. And what this is what's been called the Great Gatsby curve. It plots a measure of inequality, the Gini coefficient, against a measure called intergenerational earnings elasticity, which is really hard to understand. So I just call it class stickiness. And class stickiness means what's the likelihood that if you're born in the lower quintile, when you hit adulthood, you stay in the lower quintile. And the thing you're going to notice here is that inequality is, in fact, associated with less mobility. That is, the higher the level of inequality, the higher the level of class stickiness, so it's really a signal. The second thing you'll notice is that the only two advanced capitalist countries for which we have this data that have less mobility than the United States are the United Kingdom, and they have a queen, and Italy, and they have Silvio Berlusconi, which is kind of like having a queen, right? So we, people who say, but at least there's a lot of mobility, increasingly, that's really not so much the case. Second thing is people say, well, perhaps we're making a lot of progress. It's unequal with making a lot of progress on race. That's the sort of Oprah Winfrey argument, right? Oprah's rich, so most black people must be doing okay. And really what you find in the data is persistent racial inequalities that folks like Rebecca London have spent a long time looking at. And you can see them very much in California by looking at essentially the share of the families who are living below the poverty line, but 150% of the poverty line. You can see big differentials between non-Hispanic whites and African Americans and Latinos. And much of this will likely persist over time, unless we do something about it, because of educational inequalities. This is just looking at the Silicon Valley, but in the Silicon Valley, 54% of whites, 62% of Asian Pacific Islanders hold a bachelor's degree or better. That's only 31% of African Americans, only 14% of Latinos. 35% of working age Latinos actually lack a high school degree. So this inequality will persist over time unless we address it, and I'll talk a little bit about that. The last thing you hear, and this has been kind of the major thing Chris and I have been working on for some years, is, okay, so inequalities, you might not like it for political reasons, but there's mobility. Inequality, but at least it's not racial. Inequality, but at least it's good for growth. Because if you have a lot of inequality, there's going to be more incentives for people to become rich. The folks who are wealthy will save and invest. That'll make the economy grow over time. And while that's been sort of the conventional wisdom in economics, which I had an interesting encounter with a student the other day who was taking economics at USC and was saying, God, how do I make an argument about the minimum wage? Because in the class, they show me that when you raise the minimum wage, that unemployment goes up. And I said, well, that's really an economist approach, which is that it works fine in theory. It works fine in practice. How does it work in theory, right? Which is actually most of the evidence is when you raise the minimum wage, there's almost no employment impact at all. And there's been a very important set of books and studies about that. The conventional wisdom that inequality is good for economic growth has been challenged over the last bunch of years, really for the last 20 years, by folks working on issues of inequality and growth in the developing world, and then folks who've been working on metro issues in the United States. But the most recent sallies in this have been especially interesting. From the International Monetary Fund, Berg and Austri's papers looking at sustainable growth and finding out that the most significant predictor of growth not being sustainable over time, of a growth spell shortening, was high levels of income inequality and some measures of political fragmentation. That is, where there's a lot of economic and social distance, there's not a lot of ability to sustain growth over time. The other well-known left-leaning organization that has been spending a lot of time looking at this is the Cleveland Federal Reserve. The Cleveland Federal Reserve looked at metropolitan regions much the size of Cleveland, and what they tried to do was to ask what predicts growth over time. And some of the answers were ones you would expect: anchor universities, diversified industrial structures, educated population. But much to their surprise, there were three factors that turned out to be very important at predicting growth being slower. That was initial level of income inequality in your metropolitan region, racial segregation in your metropolitan region, and differentials between city and suburban poverty experience. Essentially, again, where there's a lot of economic and social distance, there's less sustainable growth over time. And Chris and I just, by the way, this is what now Standard & Poor's is also talking about. And Chris and I just did a paper that's coming out in Urban Studies. It's got a great title, Brother, Can You Spare Some Time? because what we're trying to take a look at is what leads to sustainable growth in America's metropolitan regions. And this is the initial level of the Gini coefficient and the length of the growth spell. If a Gini coefficient is going down, that means you're becoming more equal. And you can see that as the initial level of the Gini coefficient is lower, growth is more sustained over time. And being able to sustain growth over time is associated with both faster growth, it turns out, and since you're accumulating it, general rises in income in a region as well. Why is this happening? The research is still somewhat inconclusive on all of the mechanisms why, but it seems to be that places that are more equal tend to invest more in public education and also tend to have better capacities to resolve problems between groups in terms of the necessary investments in infrastructure or how to burden share in a time of crisis rather than to get into a war of attrition, which winds up sort of shrinking the overall pie. So there's a way in which the social relations wind up affecting the economic relations, wind up affecting the growth or accumulation process. We're actually up here this couple of days to try to finish our next book on this. But if you wanted to read our last book on this, it's called Just Growth, Inclusion and Prosperity in America's Metropolitan Regions. It is a really good book. It's available on Amazon.com. You can even get a Kindle version right now as I speak. It's about to be made into a major motion picture in which I will be portrayed by Antonio Banderas and Chris will be portrayed by Denzel Washington. Some of you may not see the resemblance, but that just means you're not post-racial and don't understand box office, right? Anyway, there's a sort of news story about the economy, and that news story about the economy needs to become part of how we move forward. So I've talked a little bit about the new demographics, talked a little bit about this new story of the economy. Now I want to talk a little bit about how change is happening in the state, and I'll do this quickly and open up for Q&A. The first thing to realize about the state, which is something that's really interesting, I talked about how demographic change occurred here. And as demographic change is now occurring in the rest of the country, demographic change is slowing down here. The generation gap I pointed to, as you might imagine, and I didn't show you the chart, that generation gap is growing in the country, right? That is, the white are disproportionately old, the young are increasingly people of color, so the generation gap is growing over time. Does that make sense? It's not growing in California. Because it was growing during the 80s and 90s, during all that period of conflict, and now it's beginning to slow down and actually stabilize. And there's an interesting set of bookends here. The generation gap in California starts to grow right at the time that Prop 13 is passed. And if you think about Prop 13, which basically shipwrecked the finances of the state, it's a declaration of generational war. That is, it's protecting the assets of those who were already here from the taxes that were going to be necessary to educate those who were coming. And the tremendous, it wound up having a boomerang effect people didn't understand, which is it also wound up protecting commercial and industrial property disproportionately, because it turns out commercial and industrial property have mechanisms to be able to disguise the changes in ownership. So for example, Michael Dell, who owns Dell Computers and is, as you might guess, kind of wealthy, bought the Fairmont Hotel in Santa Monica for, I forget how much, but it was like this huge amount of money. And he started to buy it, and he realized that once he bought it, it would be revalued. So instead, he bought it with him buying 40%, his wife buying 40%, somebody else buying 20%. And because nobody had a 50% claim, it wasn't a formal change in ownership. And because of that, the Fairmont remains valued at what it was valued for tax purposes 35 years ago. So there's a tremendous loophole in the law that Michael Dell has illustrated for us. But it's very, very common. But what Prop 13 basically did is essentially say that the assets of the old would be protected, that we would not increase property taxes on them. But for anybody who's bought property who's young, you're paying full freight. We bought a house in LA when we moved down there. Our property taxes are $10,000 a year. Across the street, the property taxes are $400 a year. Same policing services, same city services, etc. The generational impacts that's had, because it's additionally starved public education spending, higher university spend, higher education spending in the state as well. That was when I graduated from UC Santa Cruz, was when Prop 13 passed. And I remember when I graduated, I was asked to give the college speech, and my speech was about Prop 13 and how I was going to wreck the state. Remarkably prescient for a 21-year-old. But what was interesting is that we are beginning to repair the damage, right? With the passage of Prop 30, with discussions that are ongoing right now, but actually getting in and reforming Prop 13, coming to the end of that process. What's driving it? Well, we need policies. So there's a lot of discussion of workforce strategies, including raising the minimum wage in major metro areas, and of course the state is as well, transportation strategies, housing strategies, asset building, healthy communities, and educational improvement. And we can talk about those policies, but far more important than talking about those policies is talking about what moves power in the state. Because we actually do know what we need to do to change things. We just don't do it. And we don't do it because the politics are such that it becomes difficult to do it. So what's fascinating currently is that there's a tide that is turning in the state of California. Prop 30 passing, which had two aspects to it that were really striking. Maybe one of which you don't really realize, but I think it's worth it to talk about. So, first it wound up directing funding to schools, repairing some of the damage. But more important than this, there were three propositions that were going to be put on the ballot. One was what Governor Brown originally wanted to put on the ballot, which was an increase in the sales tax. And he did that because he thought business would go along. It hits everybody, hits the poor the most, must be fair. Then there were a bunch of community-based organizations headed by a group called California Calls that wanted to put a millionaire's tax on. And the head of California Calls is an organizer out of South LA called Anthony Thigpen, former Black Panther, who mobilized in the last election 500,000 new and occasional voters to the polls, including in the Central Valley. And the third was Molly Munger, who put on her own proposition, I think it was 38. And what she wanted to do was shift in the income tax in order to be directed straight to education spending. Interestingly, what went on was the proposition that was polling the best was the millionaire's tax. So Brown wound up negotiating with a bunch of community organizers to meld the millionaire's tax with a more modest increase in the sales tax. And that's what won, was what the community was pushing for, not what Brown had in mind. And Munger's initiative, on which she spent $38 million of her own money, failed. It got the least number of votes of any proposition, which showed that movement mattered more than money. And that was a very, very significant thing. We saw a year later strategic organizing by community groups around immigration, which wound up passing the Trust Act in order so that there would be less cooperation of the police in California with Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and also the political calculus changed such that the governor of California approved moving forward on an increase in the state minimum wage and approved driver's licenses for undocumented Californians. So a tide is turning in the state, and the real question is, what will make California tipped, because it seems to have tipped, become California transformed? And the fundamental answer to that has a lot to do with community organizing, infrastructure, social movement infrastructure that can make sure that these issues of social justice actually get up on the political agenda for politicians and policy makers. And thinking about that ecosystem of social movements is something that I think involves a lot of our work moving forward. Now, in doing that, I think there's going to be a couple of things that are really crucial for people who are thinking about this in terms of framing, messaging, and moving things forward. One is trying to speak to people's aspirations and not simply their anger. There's a way to think about appealing politically about how pissed people might be about different things, and to some extent that does move people. But I want you to ask yourself what has been sort of the two most successful social movements in the last 5 years. Actually 3. One was the Tea Party, which speaks to people's anger and fear. And the other 2 are the movement for marriage equality and the Dreamer movement, both of which speak to aspirations and hope and an idea of really meeting structural impediments with a strategy for changing things politically, but also a strategy for speaking to dreams, speaking to aspirations. I think in doing this, we need to continually stress that equity and inclusion are fundamental, not add-ons. I'm saying to you that I think equity is fundamental to getting the economy right. And inclusion is absolutely fundamental. If you think about the new California coming up, unless we create the right kind of pathways for that new California, we don't have a productive California as a state moving forward. And then finally, that we need to, when we do this, think about bridging generations, crossing that generation gap, and bridging the geographies. In particular, rethinking our north-south divide to think about a divide that is not a divide between coastal California and inland California, and one in which there's a relationship of mutual assistance, so that the more established organizing infrastructures and political infrastructures that are giving voice to folks who haven't had a voice in the past in places like LA and the Bay Area are able to articulate better with, provide assistance but not dominate those nascent organizations that are emerging in San Diego, Orange County, the Inland Empire, and Central California. And I think because of all that, I'm actually rather hopeful about where the state will go. And the reason why, in some sense, that's important is because if California is America fast forward, one thing we need to do is get the rest of America to calm down about the change that they're so fearful of, about the reaction that then creates right-wing policies at a national level. Because what happened in California was damaging. What is starting to happen in California is healing, and there's an example we can set for the rest of the United States. And this is where I work right now. This is my Twitter handle. Follow me. It's absolutely fascinating what I talk about. Thank you, and